right, well, in the interest of time, we've got three great panelists today, so we're going to go ahead and get started to make sure that they have a chance to share a lot of their wonderful perspectives and experiences, and hope that a few more folks will be joining us as we go. So welcome this morning to the evidence-based learning in practice session of the Policy and Learning Working Group. My name is Emily Janak. I am one of the co-chairs of this working group, and I work for CARE as part of my full-time job. Lane, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I'm Lane Pollock. I'm with USAID's Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning on the CLA team, and I work with Emily as the co-chair for this working group. We're so happy that you're here with us.
Great. And then we're going to hand it over to Malavika to get us started on some of the things from SID.
Thanks, Emily. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm going to briefly introduce myself and introduce SID Washington for those that might not be familiar with this organization. My name is Malavika Rendive, and I am the program coordinator at SID Washington. For those that don't know SID, we are the largest and most active chapter of the Society for International Development, an international network that was founded in 1957 to serve as a global forum dedicated to sustainable economic, social, and political development. We currently serve as a global town square for the international development community, bringing together people from diverse organizations, disciplines, and career stages in a neutral, independent forum to share information and discuss important issues and challenges facing our community. This event is a great example of how we normally do this. There are different ways that you can get involved with us. You can check out some of our upcoming events at sidw.org and sign up for ones that you would like to. You can also sign up for a weekly newsletter, which provides a lot of different information. And our newsletter goes out Monday evening every week. Or you can follow us on social media and keep in touch with some of our recent programming. A few things to note for this event: we will be recording this session and it will be shared publicly through our networks and our social media channels. We also do offer live transcription closed captioning, which I will enable now. And you can turn it on from your side if you click on the more settings. You can post your questions for specific speakers in the chat box. Please note that because we want to make sure we can answer as many questions as possible, but there may be some questions unanswered. We will try our best to do that. We want to hear from you. There is an event survey that will be dropped in the chat box. Please make sure you get a chance to fill it out by the end of the event. We value all of your feedback very much and want to make sure that we can improve our future events to your liking as well. A quick poll just to understand who is joining us today, and I will launch it now. All right, so I will close it now just in the interest of time because I want to make sure we can get to all our speakers. But I do see that we have a significant number of our members attending this event. Welcome back. And for those that are attending for the first time, welcome to Washington. And we hope that you will continue to support us and our events and our work groups. Oops, sorry. And then finally, I am going to turn it back over to Emily to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
All right, so we have a great panel lined up today. We have, and I think I'm going to go in order of that they will be speaking. We have Eric Camacho, who's from the Engagement, Learning, and Adapting Specialist from Claim Health and Claim Dev, working with the Panagora Group on a USAID Philippines project. We have Fatma Zara Lawan, Senior Consultant and Director for Mitsua Consult, and Emmanuel Dorman, the Senior Director for Monitoring, Evaluation, and Reporting and Learning with ACDI-VOCA. So great to have some of the working group members and some other folks presenting today, and we'll talk more. We also have Bari Rabin, who will be introducing herself as our moderator and facilitator today. So we're super excited to have all of you joining us. And as we think about the panel today and what we're talking about, this is the Policy and Learning Working Group. And sometimes it's easy as we think about it to think learning stops at the documentation. Did we write it down? And on a really good day, did we save it in the place where someone else could find it later, right? And that's a lot of times where we think about learning. Learning actually means, did we do something about it? Did we take action later? How do we put learning into practice? And as we think about that, one of the questions that comes up a lot these days is data-based decision-making, data-driven decisions. We all say we want more data and we want data to inform our decisions. But when we think about the decisions we make, there's lots of kinds of data that inform that. It's not purely based on what did the evaluation say. There's a lot of ways of thinking about data and who's in the room when it happens and how do we make sure that it's good enough, but that we haven't put up so many barriers to making sure that the data is perfect that we can't use it at all. Maybe we can't even collect it. So those are some of the big questions we're going to be thinking about today. Who needs to be in the room when decisions get made and what kinds of perspectives inform evidence? How do we get the right level of rigor and resources so that we can make decisions when we need to make them? And who really is the evidence for? Who needs to be making those decisions and what kind of data changes the way they think about the choices they're making? So those are some of our big questions today. And with that in mind, Barry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Emily. My name is Barry Rabin, and I'm with the Panagora Group. I'm a senior technical manager in our innovation and organizational learning practice. And these are some of the questions that I've been working near and around for the last about 8 years, working on adaptive management. I originally come from the knowledge management and learning world and transitioned into adaptive management. So I am also interested to hear what our panelists have to say today. So we are going to start with a round where we hear from each of our 3 panelists. And after each round, we'll have the chance for participants to share their questions or comments. Please share them in the chat as we go, as things occur to you. And then we'll have one final round after that for participant reflection and your thoughts as well. So let's start with Eric. Eric, yeah, you've heard the questions on the table. What are your thoughts? Based on your experience.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So I'm Eric Camacho. I'm joining you from the Philippines. The first question is about how do we get more people from more perspectives into a room when we generate evidence? I'd like to talk about 3 points. First is about participant selection. We need to always remember that based on adult learning principles, we need to focus our invitations. If we know what to talk about, we need to be able to identify who finds value to that information. So it's really about determining who are the key players and the interested parties. And if that information is relevant to their work, then that's the first message. That in any, even if you have very good evidence, if you're not identifying the right people to talk to, then that's an error. The second one is in the designing of the events. It needs to be participatory approach. And the best way for us to gather as much perspective based on our experience is to do mixed method in events where, just to give an example, when we throw a question, we always ask the individuals to answer them individually in a piece of paper for like 3 or 5 minutes. Thereafter, they are grouped together to homogeneous groups so that people with similar interests could try to process their individual understanding of a subject or an evidence, and thereafter opening the floor to the other mixed groups. That way, we somehow pull and generate evidence from everyone through a process thinking. And in the actual conduct, I think 3 points here. Normally, if we have evidence, we need to present it in a venue which is comfortable, which would mean using existing platforms. If you are talking about a legislative agenda, an evidence to support legislative agenda, then you join the legislative regular meetings. Because by presenting your information in a comfort zone, people are more open to discuss and share their thoughts. Second, we need to learn the business language. If you are talking to legislators, then talk like a legislator. If you talk to scientists, then talk like scientists. That way, by presenting your evidence using the language of your audience, then the more receptive they become to dialogue. And lastly, making sure that everyone actually is heard. So round robin in a small group of people, then everybody needs to be given airtime to speak. So that's my answer to the first 3 questions. It's really about designing your learning event in a way that it's focused audience, the approach enables everyone to share comfortably, and that the language that we use is something that is shared across the target audiences. On the second question, how do we maintain the right level of rigor and resources for the speed and level of decisions we need to be making based on our evidence. Here, I'd like to highlight or focus my discussion on the value of creating a dissemination plan. If you know the evidence and the results of a study, a proper dissemination plan needs to be created in a way that we segment audiences. For every finding, for every recommendation, it needs to be clear to us who is this recommendation for. And that would mean how do we do the messaging and identify this particular types of platforms where we will disseminate. Normally, if an evaluation is released by USAID, you do a dissemination of the findings. But an add-on to that, which I learned and what we are doing in the Philippines right now, is making sure that dissemination doesn't happen once. For one evaluation study that we conducted, the SID evaluation study, after the evaluators presented the general findings, we actually created sub-learning events where one sub-learning event is meant for the mission staff to be able to determine what they can generate from the information for them to make adaptive changes into the USAID framework or the program framework. Another was directed to the government, particularly to certain offices whom we thought the information that we generated from the evaluation would affect how they do things. So it is not also presented in a way that it's an evaluation report, but rather it's already converted into a language like highlighting the best practices, what worked, didn't work, rather than just saying these are our findings and these are the recommendations. So it's customizing. And having a good dissemination plan would mean that your event is well resourced because your plan needs to have money and people to be able to run it through. And the last question, which is also related, is who is the evidence for? I think at the onset, even when we design a learning event or when we design a study, a research, we need to be clear on the research question. We need to be clear, we need to create a scenario on what is it for? What is the problem that is, we need to have a clear statement of the problem and that who among your stakeholders has the responsibility, the accountability to act on the possible results of the study. So the evidence is, even in the design of a study, we need already to be clear on who will be listening to the results and who would find most value to those results. So it's really beginning with the end in mind and understanding if the theory of change, the assumption, the hypothesis is clear, because that would guide in determining whether the results from the study will be useful or otherwise. So in a nutshell, that's my initial responses to the questions. Thank you for the time. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. I have some follow-up questions. I find this really interesting and important, as you talked about the planning ahead for who will benefit from the evidence, who should be involved, and then the presenting the evidence to whoever can use it in their own kind of comfort zone. Can you give an example of how you've done that, or your team has done that?
Right now we received the results of our one evaluation that was conducted, which is SURGE, which is focused on climate change and water in the Philippines. Normally, if the first activity that was done was a general or a generic dissemination forum where the findings and the recommendations were presented. But as you know, the usual form wouldn't generate any results. So we came up with a series of dissemination and learning events where the first event that we planned out was a small group meeting, which is internal to the USAID, where instead of just presenting the findings and recommendations, we actually presented the USAID climate change and city development initiative framework. This is a framework where the project is anchored. This is what the project did, and the project accomplished the following. So based on this experience, what are the insights that is relevant to USAID in crafting the new framework? So that was the learning agenda. It was not to talk about the findings of SURGE, but rather focusing it to the interest of the AORs, which is to develop the new framework for the next project cycle. So that's the second event. The third event now is, since the project involved local government units and mayors in that were provided technical assistance, and that election is upcoming, we are planning that the dissemination is not already a dissemination of learnings and insights, but rather a briefing. So it will be converted into a session where we present the facts, the evidence, as guidance to the new mayors and the governors on how they will move forward their city development initiatives. So these are 3 samples. And right now, the 4th one, which is being designed, which we haven't done yet, was to share these insights and learning at the regional level among the different USAID offices in the region. That way, a collective understanding of the experience and how it would be useful to the other countries could be explored. So all of this these events are emanating and were designed anchored on how we could optimize or maximize the use of an evaluation of one project. So I hope that is a clear example of what we're doing in using evidence to advance goals. Over.
That's a great example, Eric. Thank you. And it looks like, Lane, Emily, we've got a question in the chat. Would you hear? I can
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah, sorry.
having a tech and tab problem. Yeah, so thank you so much. So quick question. I agree that audience segmentation is incredibly important. I'd be particularly interested in what some of the key segments that you've seen used successfully. In other words, have you segmented audience beyond the USG partner government example that I think Eric just shared to highlight specific roles within organizations or other actors such as the broader development community or private sector partners? Any insight on this would be excellent. And thank you, Todd, for the question.
Yes, thank you. Okay, yes, aligned with the same example that I provided, we actually segmented our audiences into 5. The first audience was the mission staff, who actually are involved in preparing the program plans of USAID. The second segment is the local chief executive or the mayors, the LGUs, the government, because they're the ones at the end of the day that would convert policy into implementation. The third segment were actually the national agencies. Here you have our National Economic Development, National Economic Development Authority. You have the Department of Industry, the Climate Change Commission. So these are government agencies at the national level who are focused on policy. The fourth are actually CSOs. Here you talk about the private sector. The civil society organizations include academe, the non-government organizations, including other donor agencies, where we explore a bigger picture like how could we support further the primary player in using the insights and learning to move this forward. So these are the common segments if you talk about sectoral representations when we present studies. But we don't have to think far. If you go back to developing the dissemination plans and communication plans, you have 3 particular audiences. The one that needs to decide on the action, that's one segment. The second segment is that person who could actually influence that person to make a decision. Okay? And third is the person whom we want to effect change. So those are the big 3 categories of people whom we need to reach out to. So I gave 2 examples, the categories, and secondly, the sectoral segmentation. Over.
That's great. Thank you, Eric, for explaining that. Are there any other thoughts or questions that others in the audience, the virtual audience, want to share before we move on to our next panelist?
I actually have one, if I can put one out there for Eric. I'm wondering how, if and how you engage some of those same types of stakeholders up front in the design of the learning event so that, you know, we can, as they're getting the findings from that process, that they are even more engaged, or other ways that you engage them at the end. But kind of how do you get people to interact with the process as you go?
Okay. Since we are strictly complying with the guidance of evaluation. Because I'm talking about the evaluation studies of USAID. At the design stage, it's really between the project, the evaluation team, and USAID. But in the data gathering, we employ mixed methods where we try as much as possible to reach out to people whom we work with, whether it's government or CSOs, and those that we didn't work with at all. So now it becomes the how do you call this? It's really comparing those sites that we touched and those that didn't, and try to determine if about their thoughts and feelings about the intervention that was done in other sites. So it's in the data collection method that is employed. Okay. But I think more involvement is really when the evaluation is done or the findings, we already have the result and the recommendations. Because it's more forward-looking, that based on what we did, this is what we learned, and maybe our learning is something that's valuable to you. So how do you think could these learnings and insights be useful to your organization or to the agenda that you're pushing as a collective? So those are ways of engagement that we did.
Thank you, Eric. So let's turn to Fatuma and hear what is your response to the discussion so far and the questions that we asked up front. Fatuma.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for making the time and offering this space to discuss this. Actually, I'm focusing on two questions, the first one and the third one. The first one being, how do we get more people from more perspectives into the room when we generate evidence? Most of the things I like ideas from Eric has been said by him, and I will just emphasize on the first key thing for me to ensure that is to use a participatory and inclusive approach that will allow for an accurate assessment and clear understanding with all sides of the issues, right? And this is an important element for the validity itself, but also for the wide acceptance of the funding. Then this can be translated into three key points. The first one for me is to put people in the center. I mean by this to give the importance of people experience, individual, collective, personal experience and perspective, and to be widely open to hear different views, right? And may also to be challenged, to have your own assumptions being challenged by diverse perspective from others. When it's come to gender analysis, what is mostly the example I'm focusing on, we all may have our own assumptions and bias, and we need to be free and free up our mind to get surprised with this different point of view, to allow people to tell their stories. And then you use your technical and gender lens to analyze it. Secondly, consult diverse people, as diverse as possible, because also sometimes time might be a limit, resource might be a limit, but there are some key considerations, including sex, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, depending on the context that need to be accounted. People might tend to see different things according to their own perspective, right? And people's perspective may change from one time to another, which put the dynamic aspect of it. And for instance, the same message could mean different things according to different people's perspective. So do not assume that everyone will see things from the same view that you do. The third point is to use a combination of methods, that will allow for quantitative information and qualitative information. That might go beyond the traditional tool that we use, group discussion, survey, individual interview, to some of the non-traditional way of collecting data, such as storytelling, a tool that is called the most significant change from your audience, role play, etc. So that's from the first some ideas from me for the first question. The second question is, who are the evidence? Who is the evidence for? Yes, first of all, the actor who mandates the learning is the first user of the funding. But because learning it's something that one cannot pretend to own, and for the sake of changing dynamics, one single actor cannot pretend anymore and anywhere to be the man to make this change. Therefore, the evidence-based learning or the funding should be widely open and accessible to various audiences, including governments, including donors, because donors also use this information to make decisions, civil society organizations, and more importantly, the people and communities you target for your analysis, and etc. How do we get other stakeholders to be using our data? That's an important and very critical question that actually, draw my interest in this event, because most of the time we do the learning process and then we keep it in the middle, or the learning cycle, as it's been said earlier, will not end when we have the report and the finding. The learning cycle will continue to be done until we share and we get this information reaching all the key stakeholders that need this information. This is not only for consistency or for sharing and ownership, but it's also for effectiveness and efficiency. Instead of having people reinventing the wheel, we will gain time and resources. So the first thing for me is the planning stage. At the planning stage, I am from a humanitarian background, so I made most of my work and research in humanitarian setting. So timeliness, the early you have the information, the most you are exposed the information to be shared and used by wider audiences, especially in crisis and emergency situation. But also even in the normal development, longer term context, timeliness makes sense because we have strategic planning phases that need information and evidence. If these are being considered, then we will be much more starting our planning stage to be gathering or reaching more audiences to use the data. Secondly, the purpose of the learning. The purpose should be of interest of more than the actor who mandates the learning process. That will encourage other stakeholders to be interested in knowing what will come out from this, right? Then the next is also an important one is to encourage joint learning. Whereabouts, planning to conduct this learning process together jointly. We can share resource, we can share knowledge, we can share tool, we can, and so on. And then this is kind of preparation beforehand of the ownership, or wider ownership of the process. And we have this mostly now with joint rapid gender analysis ongoing with various actors. If this is not possible, then consult with wider or as wide stakeholder as possible to gather their perspective and objective, also an interest to be incorporating into your learning cycle. You might also consider using consensual methods and tools, like the standard tools that are being agreed. It's also part of the how your finding will be, your finding validity will be received. Then a last point regarding planning is the geographical, the coverage of the scope of your research. Is it covering a wide geographical area that might embrace geographical focus by wider actors, or is it covering many, sectors that will draw, curiosity or interest from other actors? Then, if these are from my perspective on the planning stage, then the next stage, and also not less important, is the data analysis and sharing phases, reporting and sharing phases. And I agree with Eric when he was talking about the dissemination plan recommendation, and I'm going to emphasize on that. With my first point is to ensure that when we have our recommendation, the recommendation would be as practical and realistic as possible. Otherwise, it can be just a list of good intention or statement that maybe specialists can know what will entail it, but wider non-specialist actor may not. So organize your recommendation to be targeting either sector, specific sector, to be organized and clusterized in the way that you can target actors, specific actors with specific recommendation, or you can formulate your recommendation to be covering specific programmatic sectors. You may also have some overreaching recommendation that can be applying to different layers and different actors. But also you need to present, your findings and your reports. If you have 30-page reports, then you have 95% of chance of that people may not read it all. So summarize a 2-pager, a policy brief with key highlights of your findings to be shared, and you multiply the chance for wider, even non-specialists and busy people to be having a look at it. Then your dissemination plan. You need to be very thoughtful regarding the dissemination plan, and I'm also emphasizing one aspect of Eric's address regarding the dissemination plan. It needs to be adapted to various audiences. You might be sharing the policy brief with donors, with other and not like-minded actors. But for other actors, like your like-minded organization, you might need maybe to organize a live discussions, right? to share the finding, and you can focus on specific aspects that matter much for them. You may also be developing, different material to be sharing your finding with community governments, because they have different objectives and they have different mandates, and not all language or all a specific delineated recommendation will make sense to a government body in charge of all strategic issues. So all that, and what in practice, you can have this meeting, one-on-one meetings. You can have your policy brief 2-pager shared. You can have community discussions to impact and feedback to them on the funding, because they are also active actors of implementing much of the recommendation, because even if they require support, they are the main, who are targets, who this learning will be translated into action for. And then an important one, follow up the implementation of your recommendation. Even internally within the actor who mandates the learning phases, it's not giving that when it's done with all the dissemination and so on, it will be translated into action. You need to follow up, and a follow-up plan, not a one-off time follow-up, but a continuous plan will help follow up and see what is implemented, what is not, what prevents it to be implemented, what can be done, what additional learning cycle need to be open and started in order to complement and address all this. So that's some perspective from my experience responding to those two questions.
Super interesting, Fatuma. Thank you for sharing that experience and your thoughts. A few things that really jumped out to me are the notion of preparing yourself for openness. An approach that you mentioned, which is role play, and I'd love to hear in maybe another conversation about how you use that. And your follow-up plan of making sure that the learning is being used, or if there's another learning cycle that needs to be pursued after that. Let's turn to our participants. Who's got some thoughts to share or questions? I'll give you a moment to reflect on that, Lane.
Yeah, Barry, I might just highlight that Fatima began to speak to Barbara's question, actually, that she had raised in the chat earlier about when developing knowledge products, would you write a single document and then tailor the dissemination of that document, like the 2-pager that Fatima referred to, via supplemental communications, etc.? Or is it a matter of writing multiple documents, multiple products to meet the needs of different audiences? And Fatima began to speak to that, but maybe if there's anything else she might add, or Barbara, if you want to come off mute and add to your question or your experience that you've had in this area.
Yeah, I guess my question was really related to the level of effort to some extent, that if we do some extensive, rigorous research or evaluation, we want to make sure that we put that in a substantive document, right? We want to document it as rigorously as the process, but then that tends to become a large document that nobody will read. So how do we create the communications around it, or split it into multiple pieces? It's always the kind of questions that come up, and we want these to be questions that we raise at the very beginning, like in the design phase, like how is this going to look like? Who are the audiences, right? So I'm curious about any additional thoughts you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. This is a good question. And from my experience, at the planning stage, we always don't think about how we will share it. But this may be an important side of our TOR or the planning stage to make sure that we think ahead and we plan ahead, because we stop at the end most of the time, because it's the end of it's the end of the timing, it's end of the contract, it's end of resources and so on. So planning make definitely sense in that, because when it's come from my experience as a private consultant, I end the process when I deliver the product, and the product that is always required from me is one report that include all comment and so on, and then maybe some additional products such as in a PowerPoint presentation, a 2-pager. Sometimes we might think about infographics to be shared, but most of the time we stop there with recommendation on the next, and this next is the most critical part of it. Otherwise, the report will end up in the file box. Yeah, so I do think that we need to think ahead to make the resource and to think about the according to the audience. There are some audience that is mandatory for us to reach. And we know that since the beginning, but a full report of 35 pages will not reach them, because it's not, user and business people friendly. So yeah, thinking about those different ways, including PowerPoint presentation, that maybe some internal, users team could use for their own, but also for continuously sharing with stakeholder will make sense. Those infographics, but also I like the idea of why not having different products. And I will confess that from my experience, we always gather a massive amount of data that somehow our report doesn't make, justice to it, because we just extract some and we leave the rest and cut what a wastage. So if this can be done, then ahead in the planning stage, we can ask for various products, and then we can think about which kind of it would go to donor, which information should be put in it, and so on. Yeah, so thank you for this point, Barbara.
Great. Thank you for the response, Fatuma. So, Emmanuel, you've heard your two colleagues sharing their thoughts on these questions, and now we're eager to hear what you have to say. What are you thinking?
Thank you. I think my two colleagues have really raised the bar, and they've raised very important issues on why learning is important and who should participate, and how to get people to participate and not end by just generating some knowledge, but utilizing that knowledge and making sure that that knowledge is useful for those we really target. So it's really interesting to hear from my two colleagues. I think they've touched on more than I would talk about. So sometimes I may just emphasize some of what they've already said. So what I'll be doing is try to share some of our experience at SID-US regarding learning, and I'll be specifically looking at one of our projects in Kenya as a case study. This project is called the Resilience Learning Activity. So the name itself speaks for itself. The Resilience Learning Activity which is implemented in Kenya. It actually covers a bit of Somalia and a bit of the Horn of Africa, but I'm going to focus just on the Kenyan component. And just to provide some context, I'll give a brief description of what the RLA project is about. And I would highlight the activities approach to evidence-based learning and share some of the outcomes and some of the work in progress. And then I'll summarize or end by looking briefly at topic 1, trying to answer the question on topic 1. And then I will go to topic 3 and try to do a little bit more detail, share a little bit more detail on our thoughts on the 3 key questions in topic 3. So starting with a brief description of the project, the goal of the project really is to strengthen resilience capacities of Kenyan institutions and to coordinate the donor implementation partners within an umbrella in Kenya that is called the Partnership for Resilience and Economic Growth. This is a partnership that has been set up, I think it's almost 10 years now, coordinated by USAID, and it tries to bring in all implementing partners, especially those focusing on resilience, under one umbrella to try and coordinate their efforts. So the project has 4 key objectives, which is strengthening analytical capacity of local institutions, especially facilitating learning and adaptive management, improving knowledge management and strategic communications, and looking at strengthening the whole system for networking and for CLA. And it looks very much at doing this through local organizations. So the idea is that this should be locally led by the local institutions, with RLA facilitating, taking a backseat and facilitating and providing guidance and support. And that everything that is done is based on data, driven decision making. So we need to generate the data and analyze it and use that data for decision making. And another focus is that we aim at collective impact, right? So there are several donors in the same communities. Everyone is trying to achieve their own unique goal. But at the end of the day, sometimes we step on each other's toes and we repeat what others are doing, and we sometimes are even counterproductive. So how do we focus everyone's energy on collective impact? So that kind of sets the stage under which the RLA activity is implemented. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what is RLA's approach to supporting evidence-based learning and utilization of the knowledge? First, as we would all learn anyways, I think, all of us giving 10 years, 20 years, we will learn. But we're looking at situations where nobody has 10 years to learn by accident. We want to be intentional about learning because we have a limited time to achieve so much, either as implementing partners, as donors, as local organizations, as local government. We have a time-bound goals. So we cannot leave learning to chance and wait for 20 years. And, oh yeah, we did learn this, but that's gone. So how do we become intentional? How do we support, especially local government, to be intentional about learning and utilizing that learning for adaptive management, right? It's something that sometimes happens organically, but if we want to accelerate that process, then we need to have the capacity to generate clear learning agendas at the beginning. So one way that RLA does this is to build a capacity of the local county government, especially in CLA principles. So don't just train them on CLA, but after the training, we actually, or the project actually handholds the county staff to implement a CLA plan. So train on CLA, develop a CLA plan, and implement that CLA plan, with the project's role being facilitating that process. So the activity does this by helping the counties to develop local collaborative working groups. So in each county, you could find 5, 6, 7 implementing partners implementing different programs, either in health, in education, infrastructure, social services, agriculture, all of them in the same space. So how do we bring all of them together into smaller or into working groups so they can effectively learn what each partner is doing and learn to collaborate and learn lessons from each other, develop joint work plans that generates the evidence that is required to actually tackle the challenges in the districts or in the counties, right? So the project basically facilitates that this learning occurs. One example that the project used is to just use GIS mapping of the counties. And just by mapping the counties, you get a spatial view of who is working in health and where, who is doing what in education, where is the infrastructure, what is the county thinking about placing a market, where is it thinking about placing a market, and then thinking which of these should come first and which IPs should coordinate their efforts immediately, or who should wait for what to happen first. So all of this happens in a way that you're learning from each other, you're agreeing on what data to generate, so you understand each other's activity in a county or in the space, and then figure out how you work collectively to achieve what we constantly refer to as collective impact rather than individual goals. So the activity tries to look for the different investments by different IPs and tries to leverage each activity's investment so that we can get some synergies and actually achieve that impact. So there's a lot of utilization of data in this. The county generates data, the Kenya Bureau of Statistics generates data, the National Disaster Management Authority generates data, and we try to bring all of that data into the working groups at the county level and use that data to, for instance, model what the disasters and shocks has been over time. Some of it is interesting to know that there's either going to be a big drought this year or there's going to be flooding. It's hardly in between. And if you look at the data over time, you're able to model and say, it's most likely that this year there's going to be drought rather than flooding. And how do you prepare for that? And if there is drought, that's going to come with certain specific consequences. There's either going to be locusts, there's going to be certain pests and diseases. And if there's, livestock is a major part of the agricultural system in the northern part of Kenya where this project focuses. So if there's going to be drought, then you know that people are going to move their animals southwards into areas where people are growing crops, and that's going to begin to generate conflicts. So there's a lot of modeling that you can use the time series data to look at. And when you see this kind of data, the next thing is, so what? What are we doing with that data, right? There are people whose lives are dependent on either the rain or the rain not coming or the livestock. So you need to communicate, you need to have a clear communication plan on how to prepare people's minds or help people to prepare for possible shocks rather than leave it to chance and let them fend for themselves. So there's a strong need for communication. Now, how has this approach been useful for Kenya or for this activity? So you can go to the next slide, please. I know I'm not reading the slides or really looking at the slides, but it's just guiding me. So the key thing is to document different approaches, the different experiences of the different resilience activities that have occurred and continue to occur, so people don't have to grope in the dark. So documenting those approaches and generating a kind of repository, having a clear knowledge management and dissemination of what is there for people to learn from is one of the key outcomes. So the activity would work, for instance, with the Kenya crops and dairy market systems, which works mostly in the southern part of Kenya, to document what their experience is and to share that knowledge. So if I'm working in northern Kenya, you don't need to go all the way to the south to find out what has happened there, but through knowledge management and dissemination of the experience out there, you can learn from it and utilize without having to start from scratch. Some of this data and this planning has gone into developing various disaster management plans. So just looking at the spatial data, who is doing what and where, and looking at historical data and collectively. So you have these working groups collectively working with the county and developing disaster management plans. One example of a collective action in utilizing data and knowledge was last year when COVID was at its peak in many places, even here in the US. You did hear a lot of controversies as to whether it was real and what people needed to do. And it was a big deal in Kenya. So on radio, people will spread all these conspiracy theories. And what it did in one of the counties, or what a project did in one of the counties, was to bring everybody together, because the county head, the governor, he was a medical doctor. So he clearly understood what COVID was and that none of the conspiracies were really true, and it was real and people were dying. So they came together and developed a strategic communication plan, brought in the journalists, people from media houses, people from the health sector, different sectors, and together sat and learned about what COVID is, what it is doing elsewhere, how other people are managing it, and some of the diehard conspiracy theorists who sat on radio and spewed out all the things that you can't imagine, sat at the table and eventually began to appreciate that COVID was real and that washing hands and being hygienic, and that the county had put in place certain measures in the hospital with isolation. So if you fell sick, don't stay at home, go to the hospital and you'll be taken care of. All of that was documented and shared. So that was one way to really learn quickly, bring everybody collectively together, learn quickly and tackle an issue that was very pertinent. So that is how some of this learning has happened and been utilized. Currently in progress, you have the county leading in research initiatives. In the past, they would put up whatever infrastructure based on the interest of the governor or the interest of party in power. But now they're looking at, we want to construct this livestock market, but what data do we need? What evidence do we need to decide where to site it, what the size should be, who we expect to go there, what investment is, and what possible revenues can be generated. So you move from doing things for convenience to doing things by planning and researching and using data to plan ahead. They're doing things like, and this is just starting this April, they're doing things like reviewing their climate smart policies. Again, this is something that is just starting. The whole program is being reviewed, and as soon as it's approved by USAID, is going into action. And one of the other things that the activity was struggling with I'll say the first 2 years was finding people within the localities, the counties, to champion or to lead or facilitate joint working sessions, because they set up these local task working groups within the counties. But then they had to find facilitators, sometimes from Kenya, from Nairobi, to go up north and spend 3 days and 4 days and help facilitate these working groups. So that is not sustainable. That's expensive. So they try to find people within the locality, within the communities, and train them to become the facilitators of this locally owned joint working planning and implementation sessions. Now, they try to do this by looking for ways of keeping things sustainable. So the next slide, now I'm going to try to summarize and try to provide my insights on 2 of the topics. Very briefly on the first topic, and then I'll go a little bit into the 3. So for the first topic, how do we get more people into, or get more people from different perspectives into the room when we generate the evidence? And I think my 2 colleagues did a good job of that already. But what I would add is that you need buy-in, right? This particular activity, RLA, is an activity that is dealing with other implementing partners and national government institutions and local institutions. You need buy-in because everybody has their mandate, right? So how do you get everybody into the room? They need to see the need to be there. If they don't see the need to be there, then they will not be there. So you need to show evidence, right? That what are you missing out by not being at the table, right? You're still working. You're running your program. You're taking your decisions. But what are you missing by not being at the table with others, so that you can have this collective evidence for your own work? The other thing is you need to accommodate diverse views to be able to bring everybody to the table, because everybody has a different mandate. I mean, IPs have their own accountability for the funds they're giving to implement their specific programs, and they must meet that. So they have diverse interests and they have diverse views. So you need to find ways to accommodate all of those diverse views by looking at a bigger picture. I might be working in an agricultural program, but how is that impacted by health programs or by education or by infrastructure or what the county government does? So you need to get people to see the interdependence of their programming for them to get into the same room and bring the different perspectives. And that takes time, but it needs a concerted effort to happen. So for how to get the different perspectives into the room, you need buy-in, and you need to show evidence why that buy-in is good for everybody who you want around the table. For topic 3, who is the evidence for? In this instance, in this case that I shared, the evidence is for everyone. It's for the donors, it's for the local government, especially, it's for various Kenyan national institutions, it's for the implementing partners to make their work more effective, and most importantly, it is for the community, right? Because at the end of the day, we want to improve the community for the community members to have a better life. That's what all of this is about. So that evidence has to be useful to the community. And I think my 2 colleagues earlier on alluded to this fact very clearly. How do we get other stakeholders, the governments, the partners, the participants to use the data? So we generate the data, we learn. So what? In the case of RLA, what the activity has done is utilize this for joint planning, joint implementation where possible. I would say joint implementation is probably the most difficult of the cycle. Joint planning happens very easily. Everybody's committed. Joint implementation becomes a little bit more difficult because people have different resources and different priorities, and they are more eager to achieve certain results than other results. So joint planning is encouraged. We try to do as much of that as possible, but I would say that is where the real challenge is. But joint monitoring, joint evaluation, joint sharing of lessons and learning is the best way to get everybody to utilize that data. My colleagues all alluded to knowledge management, right? If we generate data and analyze, we want to present it in a way that is easily assimilated by the different stakeholders. So we want to generate reports that are easy to read, user-friendly. We don't want to present raw data of 100 pages to anybody. Nobody's going to look at it. A 20-page report sometimes is even too much for somebody to read, right? And I think my two colleagues alluded to that very clearly. So you need to have a knowledge management system which is very focused on the clientele, very focused on the stakeholders you're trying to reach, and packaged in a way that is easily knowledge and the lessons and the data and the learning from it is easily accessible and easily utilized by different stakeholders. So that is it for utilization. Then does that change how we generate or how the data is shaped? I would say yes, it does. Or when we simply implement our own programs or projects and we're looking at our own project goal from a narrow perspective, we go straight and collect the data that is useful for our individual activities. But in this instance, you need to look at a bigger picture. You need to appreciate that you may be required to go beyond the data that is just for you. Right? If we agree jointly to monitor and to collect data, and I'm in one community and you are in a different community, then we need to agree that in my community, I'm collecting my data, but also try to collect some of the data that my other partners need. So they don't have to go to that same community and they will do same for me. So the way we generate data becomes a little bit more demanding if we really want to do this collectively, right? So we need to be conscious of that and look at the bigger picture. We want collective impact. We need to look at the bigger picture beyond our narrow program objectives. And I can't emphasize this more. This takes time. This is a difficult process. It doesn't just happen. It takes time, and sometimes we're not patient because if I have a 4-year project, I have a midterm evaluation coming on in the 3rd year, my goal is not so much what, and I shouldn't be saying that, but that's the truth, right? My goal is not so much whether my other partner project is achieving their goals or not. My goal is that am I achieving my goals and am I showing results that would enable my donor to continue to fund my program to the end. So it is tricky. So we need to find ways to be supportive of each other's effort. So we win collectively or we lose. Maybe some would win still, but the goal really is to try and win collectively. So we're competitors sometimes. We have different companies competing for the same funds from the same donors in the same space. But we need to recognize that just by competing and out-competing each other and not reaching any meaningful results in our interventions, in the long term, does not speak well of any of us. And so platforms like this that SID provides, I think is a great opportunity to emphasize that need and recognize that we would have be patient and support each other if we want to collectively generate data and collectively utilize the data and make an impact. So I think I will stop here. I'm sure I've gone over my time, and I'll be happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. That was really helpful to hear your points illustrated through the resilience learning activity. Some important themes. Interesting to hear about how you how this activity does this through working groups. The importance of planning and intentionality. I'd like to offer a round for the other panelists to kind of comment on what you've heard from your colleagues so far. What's resonated, or what would you like to add? And we'll start with Eric. What are your thoughts, Eric?
Yeah, while listening to our two colleagues, thank you for sharing your insights. I was just reminded by a challenge that we had, specifically in conducting evaluation. Sometimes we're limited because the evaluators are so evaluators. What am I saying? They go out, find observations, generate recommendations, and then they say that that's the end of the line. One experience that we just had was we challenged our evaluators. Okay, this is your evaluation. Thank you very much. It's very comprehensive. But what now? Could you translate your evaluation results in a manner that it could be useful for others or into practical terms? So we actually convinced our evaluators to recast and produce new material, new PowerPoints, which is customized to answer certain questions of specific audiences. So I'm flagging this because data, the way you present data is as important as the data that you're presenting. But it becomes valuable when it's understood by the audience whom you want the behavior or the action to take. So that's one thing that I'd like to add. And secondly, any learning event, any dissemination event should have two parts. The first part is talking about the insights and learning, and the second part should always be an adaptive management session. In our case, there is no learning event conducted that does not have a part two where, okay, what are the insights that are valuable to you and how does it affect your work? So given that this is the recommendation, what will you do? Which of the recommendations will you accept or adopt and come up with an action plan? So those are the 2 points that I just wanted to add in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. That's a great approach of having 2 separate sessions, one just to focus on what was learned and the second to focus on how is it going to be used. Great. Fatuma, what are your thoughts? What's resonated with you? What would you like to add?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you both panelists for the interesting insights. What I keep first is, the need of, a well thought planning for the evidence learning, to be shared and to be learned and actioned against by diverse actors. And indeed, this takes time because, having, to bring diverse people on the table itself, even the planning stage could take its time, and then organizing to move. And I have a specific example of a general analysis that we conducted 2 months ago for Haiti for the earthquake, which is jointly led by Care International and UN Women. And it gathered not only those 2 actors, but also UNICEF and other UN agencies, but also local civil societies. So it's layered the process up along with all the actors' objective capacities, availability and so on. So it makes it's the perfect word, but then we need to factor the implications and think twice on, do we need this finding to come out in 2 weeks, or do we take the luxury to wait until 2 months? That's a very, very critical. And the second also, when it's come to have joint exercise, it's a really good condition for it to begin, and with, you know, a good chance to be shared and learned and action against together. But you know, how we organize, how we coordinate to make this joint exercise, you know, a good one, not, you know, a burdensome or waste of resource and time. And at the end, we, you know, but learning is also part of that. We try and we see how it goes, and we try next time, we improve, and then we continue until we get to the perfect, you know, model. So that's what all this, you know, struck in my mind. Then the LRA experience, it's kind of unique because it's not, you know, common or widely spread to have 4 years funded, you know, evidence learning initiative, which you know would be great to have, but now with limited resources and, you know, various challenges around, maybe this is kind of unique opportunity that, you know, the country that are implementing it need to be thoughtful to learn about and to take something out of it that will make impact in you know, instead of, you know, coming 4 years together and then let it down at the end. So that's what comes on my mind. But I would like to add also on the timeliness. You know, in humanitarian setting, even if you don't do all the rest of condition of joint planning, joint consultation, if you come out with the information at the very first stage, then you get a step ahead of others. And sharing this information with them, anyone is looking at this data. You know, it's very critical condition to have the information being used and the learning to be shared quite systematically by its own, because it's the first, you know, information we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. Emmanuel, would you like to add anything?
Not a lot, except to say that learning has to be intentional, and you need to really have a plan on who is going to do what kind of data you're going to collect to learn, and how you're going to utilize the data. So whether it's a learning agenda or it's a CLA action plan, you need to document it. You need to have everybody who is involved in generating the data at the table as you develop that plan. And that kind of helps create some accountability. If we do a joint work plan and we do a joint CLA action plan, and we agree that we're going to do certain things, then we become accountable as individual partners to make sure that it happens. So yeah, I think collective action requires that we build together, and we have a plan that we all agree to, and we remain accountable to our role in that plan.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I have one last question for the panelists, and I'm going to start with you, Emmanuel. I'm wondering about advice to others. So what advice would you give other teams, future teams, on how to raise the chances of evidence-based program design, implementation, or decision-making in general?
I think the key is not to go to anybody with the I know it all attitude, but to go with I know some, right? This is what I know, this is what I've learned, and I want to learn from you as well, and we together can have a bigger pie if we put our knowledge together. That together we would have something bigger and more useful. We can create synergies than each of us keeping what we know to ourselves and trying to utilize it in our own small way. So I think you really want buy-in, but you want buy-in in a way that people feel valued, that people have something to share, not that I just have something to give to you. So I think it's the way we engage with, whether it's local government, whether it's our colleague implementing partners, or whether it's our donors, it's the way we engage with them would make a lot of difference.
So it sounds like engaging with some humility. That's some good advice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fatima, what do you think about that question? What advice do you have for future teams?
Yeah, the advice is to insist in being intentional and deliberate on the learning cycle, and also on the fact that this learning should not be kept for ourselves only. Then the limited resource will be used either to develop additional capacity to make this happen, or to joint efforts, you know, to make it work all together. I am thinking about, you know, having knowledge and management teams or capacity embedded into organizations who will, you know, invest time to do kind of regular desk review or kind of wrap up of what does exist in there, you know, remind ourselves and get those knowledge and prepare them in a way that can be easily accessible by program designer, by program managers, by donors, you know. When they design, they have the information handy for them. They don't have to go and maybe chase this information before coming to design, and most of the time they don't have time to do it, or they even don't know that it does exist, right? This, for me, it's critical. And just thinking about it, you know, the rest is when we have this capacity and we are deliberate to build the capacity, we will make it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. And Eric, final words of advice for future teams?
Thank you. I think the most important thing is at the onset, at the very onset, you must have a clear learning agenda. Your learning questions needs to be very defined, because once that's clearly defined, the knowledge gap is defined. We know who wants the answer to that question. And thus we design our evidence generation, our methodologies to make sure that whatever this data collection and activities would feed to answering that learning question. Okay? And those who are interested in the answer to that question becomes your target audience. So if this at the onset is clear to us in setting up any activity, any program or project, or any learning event, then I think you're on the right direction. Are the things that you're doing contributing to answering your original learning question, which is the interest of X number of audiences to do some change, to produce impact? So as a reminder, unless it's not the purpose, it's more of what is the question that you are trying to answer and testing out. So that's my advice. Over.
Good advice, Eric. Thank you. So Emily, I'm going to hand it over to you to give some final words in closing.
Great. Well, first of all, just a huge thank you to all of our panelists and to you, Barry. Really learned a lot from this session, and I always love hearing other people's experiences and thinking, oh, that's something I could use, or that's something to learn. I would also say take a look. People have dropped some resources in the chat. So there are some links to other tools like this that may be useful or helpful for you. And then huge thanks to everybody who participated today. It's always great to see folks on the line and who's interested. A quick reminder, we do have a LinkedIn group for this working group. And also you've got access to email for me and for Lane. So if you have suggestions of things you'd like to talk about, or in this case, panels you'd like to propose, that's how this one got started. Is Barry came to us and said, hey, we have an idea. And then other people said, oh yeah, we could talk about that. We'd be interested too. So we always love to hear more from the people in the working group about what they'd like to see. Lane, anything you want to add?
Just a second thanks to everyone, and to Barry and to our panelists and to Sid Washington. Thank you for everything you guys do to support our sessions.
All right, and then Malavika, over to you. I know sometimes there is a survey at the end. Is there anything else you want to make sure that we check in on before we log out today?
No, I think the survey link has been sent in, and as you mentioned, the LinkedIn group, Emily, I'll make sure to add the LinkedIn group link with our thank you email to all the registrants. And so if you are interested in joining the group, you can, and we'll give you access to it. All right, thank you, and have a good rest of the day, evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.